Hi everyone, my name is Nick. I'm one of the A&E ST4s, and if it's possible to get stage fright in your own room, now you're about to witness it. So I've done this as initially as a little learning project or a research project with Ian, who's one of the A&E consultants at St. Mary's. And it was just to see what could we learn from that whole topic. But I've sort of adapted that a little bit for the audience at hand, and I understand that a lot of us here are pediatric trainees, or we all are here, and some are even trying to subspecialize into emergency pediatric training. What am I going to go over? I'm going to go over a brief background about Grenfell, the timeline of events of what happened, the timeline of events that happened at St. Mary's in particular. Going to go a little bit into about major incidents and what that involves. We're going to go into how that's triaged at scene and how that evolves, a little bit about how we performed at St. Mary's at the time, and then not to go too much into it, but it's definitely a good time to mention about burns and smoke inhalation. And then I'm going to offer some time for questions. It's not a long talk. It's only about 30 slides long, and I'm kind of trying to make it not too heavy. Okay, so Grenfell Tower was a tower that was completed in 1974, 24 stories tall and 6 flats per floor, and there's sort of 20 on the top 20 floors. So in the first 4 floors, non-residential. And it already paints you a picture of how densely packed this place is. It's 120 flats, 200 bedrooms. And whilst it is in the Royal Borough of Chelsea and Westminster, one of the most salubrious boroughs in the country, let alone London, this particular area is not as rich as some of its other counterparts. And you could imagine that in this particular urban setting, how many people may have lived there. Okay. But what actually happened on the 14th of June, 2017, and it almost happens to be 3 years to the day when this all kicked off. And this was a document produced by the London Fire Brigade sort of about a year later. And it chronologically puts the timeline of what happened between when it was first called out to about 2 a.m. And there's many, it's about a few hundred pages. So at 10 to 1, a gentleman wakes up on the 4th floor to a fire alarm. And gets on the phone, calls, alerts his neighbors, calls 999 saying there's a fire. Within a minute after that, 3 fire engines are deployed and sent out to Grenfell. And it's not long after, only 4 sort of minutes later, when 4 additional fire engines were then sent. Within about another 15 minutes, the fire has now leapt across 2 more floors up to the 6th floor. And even beyond that, another 5 minutes later, it goes up even quicker, now to the 11th. And the police force are then asked to come and attend a few minutes later. The paramedics are then swiftly involved a few minutes after that. And by 1:30, the fire has already reached the roof. So I'm going to stop there for a second just to help you appreciate exactly how quick this fire was. So from the person waking up, calling, barely just over half an hour, and the fire has already reached the roof. And it's not long. That's a very, very short amount of time. Okay, hoping it goes to the next one. All right. So major incident is declared. So what is a major incident? Okay, so the definition goes saying, this is where any emergency that requires special arrangements to be implemented by one or all of the emergency services. So that could be police, that could be paramedics, it could be fire, and will generally include the involvement either directly or indirectly of large numbers of people. Okay, so this definitely qualifies. Between the hours of 0054 to 2 a.m., 114 separate calls are made out to 999. And that document actually lists over the hundreds of pages, and some of them are very harrowing to read, so I won't go over it, about calls being made within the building, outside the building, telling you how many people were in and out, how they managed to escape. So a large volume of calls. Number of fire engines at the scene increased from 25 to 40, truly difficult to manage. The paramedics were called out at 1:30, so around half an hour after it all kicked off, because initially I think it was just hoped that this was just a fire thing, and then very quickly became, no, it's more than just a fire, it's going to be people inside as well. So who were involved? Altogether, there were 6 hospitals, 68 patients across 6 hospital sites. So that would be obviously St. Mary's being the closest, and if you can see my cursor, that's there, and each heart mark represents the hospital site. Charing Cross, the Royal Free, St. Thomas's, Chelsea and Westminster, and even King's, which is 7.5 miles away. So this was a major event, a major incident, that required not 1, 2, 3, but 6 hospital sites to just help and cover the volume of patients that's being coming across. So a further 10 people who were then not transported by paramedics made their own way, so making a total of 78 people. Okay, and here I'm just going to put a little quote out of what the operations director said, saying, "We initially sent out ambulance crews, advanced paramedics, advanced trauma teams for London's air ambulances, as well as hazardous area response teams to carry specialist equipment, including breathing apparatus, and we treated patients for a large range of injuries, including smoke inhalation." And I'm just putting it there because it gives you a bit of context. It's not just the paramedics, but truly everything and everyone was deployed, partially because obviously there's a large amount of smoke, and you can't just send people unprepared into a situation. So that was part of that there. Okay. So what happened from our point of view? So what happens not at the pre-hospital, but rather at the hospital setting? St. Mary's, for those who haven't worked there, or for those who've never had to visit it, is 10 stories tall. So it's quite tall as far as some hospitals might go. And it kind of overlooks quite a nice view over the Westway overpass. And you can actually see Grenfell, the tower itself, from the 8th, 9th, or 10th floor. So even before the major incident was called out, the nursing staff, the doctors could see a large plume of smoke already coming out. People probably already filtering that message down to A&E guy going, "Guys, there's something going on. We've got a fire, and it looks pretty bad." So we already know there's something already happening. And the bleep goes off. And the bleep, when it does go off, and if you had an MTC, it usually tells you one of 2 things immediately. First thing they usually say is going to be saying, well, who's going to be involved in nurse in charge, site manager, to TTL. And the first thing it says is major incident standby, saying there is something happening, be on alert. And to be quite frank, by the time you get this message, you've already got a good idea of what's happening, partially because of social media. So even during the Parsons Green bombing or attempted bombing, the Westminster Bridge, the news are filtering through BBC, and you can see through Twitter, and you know almost already what the major incident is going to be. You already stood up. Now, one of 2 things can then happen is either you're told that you are actually going to have the major incident, or you can be stood down. Obviously, in this instance, major incidents declared. Okay. And it's perhaps the worst of times because it's, it's a night shift. It's the nighttime. It means we're thin on the ground, and we're thin at A&E. We're thin everywhere. It's nighttime staffing. And it's A&E of all things, and it's obviously going to be very busy, and it's busy like any other night. And on the receiving end, so when you're the person carrying the bleep or the TTL that night, you know that there's a fire still ongoing, and you're going to get an update every so often saying P1s, P2s, P3s, this many of each are going to come to your department shortly. And I'm going to go over P1s, P2s, P3s, you know, in a little bit more details in a second, because obviously that's a bit of a term you might not be all too familiar with. Okay, so this following few documents are taken from the NHS England's clinical guidelines for major incidents and mass casualty events. So first thing, major incidents can be external as well as internal. In this case, obviously external. And how is this message conveyed to us at the receiving end? So it's not unlike a priority or a blue call. In much the same way you get your pediatric priority call saying, I've got a 3-month-old respirator of X, heart rate of Y, and you get a flavor of what's about to come your way, so you know how to prepare yourself. But this is a different beast entirely. So actually, what you get told is a methane breakdown. So it's going to be the major incident standby. Where's the location? So this one's going to be at Grenfell Tower. The type of incident, fire. So you already know you're expecting smoke inhalations and burns. Hazards, are they going to be, are you thinking about like cyanide poisoning because it's internal, smoke is not escaping the room? Access, and this is quite obviously points to ingress and egress from the hospital site. You know, how many people are coming all at once? Are you able to take this all in? Is there going to be a backlog of jams? You know, you have to think about logistics in a real way. How are you going to make this all happen in a safe way? The number of people are coming. And then finally, what services do you require? Okay, and there are things which you wouldn't expect, you wouldn't think that you might need, that you don't realize until it actually happens. And we'll go into that as well. Remind me, because there's not a separate slide if I forget to talk about it. Major incident standby. So when that happens, yes, from my point of view, the emergency department is almost all I care about, saying, what do I need to do? But actually this is, as soon as that's done, not only is the TTL involved, the nurse in charge of your department involved, it's actually 3 other parts as well, largely speaking. So that's your ICU, your theaters, and all the other wards. And I say this because I've spoken to the Mary's ICU consultants, you know, what they did at the time. They sort of identified almost half their ICU patients saying, right, you know, all these patients who we couldn't extubate for so long, or we couldn't step down, who are the safest ones we can step down rapidly? And at the ward level, consultants would be brought in thinking, right, all these people who are just waiting their package of care, so now off you go. We need to empty out the wards. We just have to empty out the department so that we can take a huge influx of patients. And theaters have to start thinking about, right, we've got patients who might have really, really poor airway, or they might need to have escharotomy. So all these parts are in place simultaneously. And obviously the same goes for pediatrics. So peds, I assume, you know, you're expecting these patients. Does your hospital have a PICU or a NICU? If it doesn't, does it need to send it out elsewhere? Does it have the right subspecialty for burns and plastics? And even so, like in the case of Chelsea and Westminster, does that burns and plastics unit have its own PICU? It doesn't. So, you know, how are you going to extricate that person or patient to somewhere that does? So lots of moving parts. Initially, though, in the A&E setting, you know, you're going to find out. You're going to make sure that you've got the major incident now is activated. So you've got usually every, no, I'm not saying usually, every A&E department does have a major incident plan, and there is one that you can print out fairly rapidly. And at the very front page, almost all of them, it almost seems like a running in joke. It says, if it's the first time reading through it, don't try to read through it all. And that's the first thing they'll say, because it's far too large a document to try and digest everything in a very critical incident. And then you want to try and establish an ED triage station. In our case, I believe it was Prof. McConaughey at the very out, you know, at the ambulance ramp literally ushering people in and triaging them from the outside coming in. Okay. And this is, again, A&E specific. You're going to assemble triage teams. You're going to nominate the roles, and you're aiming, okay, for very, very intensive care, because it's one doctor and one nurse per incoming casualty. That's quite a lot. You don't usually get one-to-one nursing outside of ICU, and it gives you a flavor of exactly what this really means. You might want scribes and photographers, and for even places like Mary's, where if it is a major incident, we revert away from electronic typing like Cerner, which we're all used to and quite frankly I love, to handwriting. And that's a hard transition if that's not something you're used to. All of a sudden you might need to find pens, you might need to print all of these things out that you didn't need to do. And there's a lot of practical things that becomes, you know, very evident when it comes to it. Your minors, for the most part, get them all home. If they're minor injuries, they're probably going to be fine. Majors, if you're going to admit them, admit them. Don't drag your heels over it. And imaging, if you're going to image. If you don't think it's important enough to image right now, that can wait as well. So it's just essentially trying to say we're taking a huge incoming number of patients. Let's see how many we can treat very quickly. Okay. This particular triage tool is designed specifically for major incidents. Very simple parameters. So, you know, catastrophic hemorrhage, yes or no. These are just yes, no questions. They're not asking for very many things up until this point. But when there's a mass casualty event, simple is better. For just a minute though, I want to draw your attention to the fourth row where it goes, airway open / breathing, no, dead. This isn't, do they have a DNA CPR? You know, this isn't you trying to work out and having a conversation with the family. This is just saying at a pre-hospital setting, once you establish they don't have a catastrophic hemorrhage, they're not, and you know, they are injured, but they're not walking, and you just check the airway and you say, are they breathing? Yes, no. If they're not, they're dead. And you move on to the next person. And it's really hard to translate that into a hospital setting because that's unthinkable. Once you're in a hospital setting, that's commence CPR, especially in children, until told for some very good reason to do otherwise. And it's hard, isn't it? This is 70 odd people all coming out of a building. Are they breathing? Yes, no, and that's it. Okay, so more than that though, there is a card that's attached, and it's like a little band that can go either over the wrist, or if it's a lanyard, can go over around the neck. And it really simplifies your P1, P2, P3, which, you know, translates into priority 1, priority 2, priority 3. Red being dangerous, you need attention straight away. Yellow being, yeah, you're okay. You're probably fine, but we have to keep an eye on you. Priority 3 is, roughly speaking, you're probably fine. In a pre-hospital first eyeball setting, that's your triage tool. That's your P1, P2, P3. In catastrophic hemorrhage, it doesn't really matter anymore. If you're bleeding really, really poorly, you're a P1. If you're unconscious, you're a P1. If your respirate is below 10 or above 30, you're a P1. So you can, you know, largely speaking, these very simple clinical parameters are very, very useful because it rapidly tells you who you're worried about and who you're just a little bit less worried about. I mean, for instance, it goes, are they walking? If they're walking, chances are their GCS is going to be just fine. They're breathing probably well enough to just circulate their head, and they can walk just fine. So, you know, they're probably P3. En route to you, however, they'll come in, and it might be that 7.5 mile journey to King's College Hospital. Their parameters might change, or they might arrive to St. Mary's and they're waiting or queuing up in the ambulance, or they're waiting to be offloaded, and their parameters might change. And sorry, and this, I do apologize. I'm just going to mute this. Let's turn it off entirely. Right. Their parameters might change, and the way they score it is in 3 things. They look at their GCS, They look at their blood pressure and rest rate. They don't look at anything else. They don't look at comorbidity. They just look at those 3 little parameters, and they give you a score based on those three parameters. Obviously, pediatric GCS, slightly different. I'm not sure how quite it translates, but remembering the fact that essentially what they're trying to say is, if you score high, you're doing well. If you're scoring low, you're doing very poorly. If you're 0, you're dead. So if you're GCS 3, not breathing, no blood pressure. You know, if you have a very low score like 3, you're probably doing very, very poorly. And you might have left as a P2, but you might get bumped up as a P1. Okay, right. So how do you decide which patients go to which hospitals? And there is a triage tree for that too.
Sorry, Nick, sorry to jump in. There's a couple of questions for you in the chat that I think would be good if they are addressed now. One from St. Heliers.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I closed the chat box because I had open earlier. I apologize. Where am
that's
I?
Fine, I'll remind you.
Can this be enlarged? Can't see the chat. Okay. For step 4, if they aren't breathing but have a pulse, sure they stay as P1, not left as dead. Yeah. This is imagine you're at a crash site of an airplane, and you're the person trying to rescue hundreds of people, and you only have very limited resources. This is sort of ATLS style. You're trying to do as much good as possible for as many people as possible with the limited resources you have. So if you're not breathing at scene, I'm not sure exactly how strictly they stick to it, but they're left as dead. And this is simply saying, I can't rescue everyone. This is the sad reality is if you're one of so very few people, you have to do as much as you can, but you can't rescue everyone. And I think that's the situation. And that's the heavy-hearted message I kind of wanted to bring across. So yes, some of them might be left as dead. Is the point he's making, if they aren't breathing, don't check for pulse, they're dead, is very different assessment tool. Can this be enlarged? Can't see the chat. Is that all right? Is it okay if I can just move on? I think.
Yes, I think it is.
Is that all right? Okay, I've got the chat open on the side, so I'll keep a close eye on that now. I do apologize. Okay, so major incident theme, the methane report's gone out, so you're receiving and you know what's coming over to you. MTCs, so your Royal London, your St. Mary's, your King's College, and I forget the other one. They will all receive P1s, almost exclusively P1s, because there are other hospitals, DGHs. Any hospital with an A&E is a trauma unit or an MTC. Anyone that doesn't have that is a LEH, a local emergency hospital. So places that might have a urgent care center, but not an A&E, if that makes sense. Okay, so you can really divide the workload, because there's no way St. Mary's A&E can take in 68 ambulances all at once. That's not doing anyone any favors. And the same goes for pediatric side as well. And that for the pediatric, it's less than 12 years. If you're over 12, you're considered an adult. So if you're 12 and over, you're considered an adult. If you're less than 12, you're considered a ped. And again, it's the same kind of triage tree. It's saying P1 goes to MTCs, P2, so forth, and P3s, so forth. But with small little caveats I want to add to that. One, so I'm going to draw the attention to the top right-hand corner saying self-presenters of any age group can present to any medical facility. It is not unheard of for people who might end up walking to their nearest hospital, which is just an urgent care center, and they might have soot on the nose or mouth, and then they're like, actually, this is an airway issue. We need to get you to somewhere that can intubate you potentially very soon. Let's send you somewhere else. But expect to treat the casualty as no ambulance transfers will be available that day. All the ambulances will be tied up almost exclusively to that fire. Very little will be going to and fro hospitals unless absolutely required. So be prepared. If you have an on-site anaesthetist for whatever reason, they might need to be involved. Then people outside of their skill set might need to be involved, potentially. If regional capacity is exceeded, that is to say, if for any reason you can't manage the sheer number, you might have to go to other MTCs. Or in the case of London, if we don't have enough hospitals to deal with particular burns, we call France. I don't know how that'll work post-Brexit, but that's the current protocol. So, you know, we really do look far, far and wide to see how we can help as many people as possible. Okay. How does this major incident roughly translate? Put it really quite simply, P1 equals resus, P2 equals majors, P3 equals minors. I don't want to overcomplicate it more than that because it really does translate quite well into those sort of three broad stroke categories. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about who came to Mary's because just going to say what happened there. So a total of 45 patients arrived between 3 a.m. and 3 p.m. the next day, which, you know, for some reason I think was how long we were stood up for because we knew there was potential for a lot of walkers to come in, people to walk in to our A&E saying, I will at Grenfell. So we might have had it been stood up for quite some time, of which 10 patients were related to the fire, 9 came with paramedics, 1 arrived via, you know, on foot, as I said earlier. Out of the 10 we received, 8 of them were received in the small hours of the morning. 3 of them were what we call peds. 7 were aged, you know, above 16. All pediatric cases that we received were P1s, so they were all very, very critical. Now, we also received one from Chelsea and Westminster because, as I said earlier, Chelsea and Westminster, as I believe at the time, didn't have or doesn't have a PICU, so we received one from them as well. We also had 1 cardiac arrest and 1 tubed for smoke inhalation injury. And this is, again, at the small hours of the morning when you're generally quite thin on the ground. So it's something to consider. And this here is a little graph. I quite like this graph because it kind of hopefully becomes quite easy and apparent as to what's going on. Each bar going horizontally represents a single patient and their length of stay in our A&E department. If they're green, they were related to Grenfell, and if they're red, they're not related to Grenfell. So this is when it starts at 3 a.m. and it goes up till, well, it goes up to midnight, but this is roughly when it stopped our major incident. And a lot of patients that were not, you know, we were only, if Grenfell hadn't happened, we might have only seen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe very few other patients, and we would have been quite fine. But obviously because of Grenfell, we had a lot more patients. I appreciate that a lot of other patients would have been diverted away from us to other hospitals so that we could take in only these P1s, but still a lot of patients that came in, and this is a lot of resus patients, to put it another way, all at the same time. What was our response from specialties? What was our response from the subspecialties? We have neurosurgeons on site. We need to contact burns, plastics, we ortho. Honestly, near frictionless. It was possibly, from all accounts, I wasn't there that night, but from every account I've been hearing from consultant down to juniors who were on that shift or around that shift, they said it was possibly the best working environment they ever had, near frictionless. More patients were being directly seen by specialty. They say, look, this is quite clear barn door, you know, peds case or medic case. We'll just see them so that EM or us, we could focus specifically at the most acute patients. Documentation, on the other hand, kind of suffered a bit, maybe because of the rush, maybe because it's not a system we were used to back on pen and paper. So there was, you know, there was definitely some poor documentation. In one instance where there was no documentation for someone who came and discharged, so, you know, it wasn't the best, but on the whole, it varied in quality. Okay. Yeah, there's nothing more to say. I'm going to now sort of delve into burns and smoke inhalation injury, if that's all right. And this is actually taking off straight straight off of the NHS England's clinical guidelines for major incident mass casualty events. I'll be providing a link for that at the end. It's a really, really good reader-friendly document. It's about 100 odd pages long, but it goes through just about everything from gun shooting to poisonings to, in this case, fire. So all 10 patients that we received at St. Mary's were smoke inhalation injuries. None of them were burns. Okay. And I'm going to talk about burns briefly, that any upper airway injury can cause swelling and potential loss of airway. And I'm going to draw your attention again now to the upper right-hand corner, where this is what you want to see when you're about to tube a patient, not that. And it's the swelling. So your airway can be quickly lost, and in peds, probably even quicker still. So please, 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 if you see soot in or around the nose or mouth, think about tubing, and think about tubing early. There's very little defense otherwise. You might want to sit and wait and see how long they can pant for, but really what you're not worried about is the respirate. It's like, is their airway still going to be patent? Am I going to be really, really struggling to tube them if I leave this decision too late? Provide supplemental oxygen wherever possible. If your PaCO2 or CO2 hemoglobin is anything above 5%, you should just be giving oxygen. If it's above 15, requires admission. So just give oxygen for the most part. There are other ways you can treat cyanide poisoning, which I'll go into, but for the first part, the simplest thing we always do is just chuck oxygen onto the face. Can barely do any harm. Be aware in children, if you're going to see burns, and if you see especially full, not even full thickness, or just circumferential burns around the abdomen in children, they are abdominal breathers. So you got to start thinking about, does this patient need an escharotomy? All right. So an escharotomy, and I apologize, I know these are some not the best pleasing pictures. I should have given them a little bit of warning beforehand, is you're not cutting away the eschar, or the tough leathery tissue that remains after full thickness burns is called an eschar. An escharotomy is performed by making an incision through the eschar to expose the fatty tissue below due to the residual pressure. And you're essentially trying to alleviate pressure below, because if you have a full circumferential burn around, say, a limb, it's a good place for it to develop a compartment syndrome. But if you have it around the body or torso, you can't breathe. Your chest is tight. You don't have the elasticity any longer. So you need to relieve the pressure, and that's what you're doing. It looks horrific, but it's actually what you need to do. And you rarely ever get compartment syndromes in arms, for example, but in this case, you really have to start thinking about it, and they'll make an incision along the digits to make that happen. I won't go too much into the other parts, because I believe burns is either already covered or will be covered by someone else. So I won't go too much into it, except to say, obviously, fluid replacement. You've got your London-Bowder chart that will help you paint a picture of exactly how much or what proportion of the body was burnt. And obviously, again, it's all about fluids, isn't it? There's a lot of inappropriate loss. Cyanide poisoning. So it's one thing to have carbon monoxide poisoning when you're in a little stuffy room. It's another thing entirely when you have burning plastic, and then you might actually have cyanide poisoning on top of that. This is a bit dense, but I put it all there so that if people wanted to read it, because I'll be sharing this slide, they can sort of read it through a little bit more. But the whole point of the thing I'm trying to say is hydroxycobalamin, which is the heralded drug for cyanide poisoning. First of all, okay, there's no good data on it. I'm not saying don't use it. I'm just saying just be aware. There's no good data on it. Okay, the mechanism of action for hydroxycobalamin, it binds cyanide to its non-toxic form of cyanocobalamin, which is then excreted in the urine. Hydroxycobalamin doesn't interfere with oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. Okay, and it is that makes it quite a useful tool, especially if you think about, alongside its carbon monoxide poisoning. And it's believed that even it takes at least 5 grams of hydroxycobalamin administered over 10 minutes to neutralize a lethal dose of cyanide in adults. So you do need to give quite a bit. There's no way you can do a randomized controlled trial for cyanide poisoning. I just can't imagine that ever being possible. It has been done in controlled laboratory settings with animals where it seemed to have worked. But again, it's just something to consider. Don't hinge everything on the hydroxycobalamin. Okay, it's just something to be aware about, and that's what you want to use. So in summary, Grenfell was a fire that happened almost 3 years ago at around 1 in the morning. It's a 24-story block with 200 flats. 140 fire engines in the end with 720 London fire brigades. There were 78 patients in total across 6 hospital sites. Most of them escaped. 70 were injured. Unfortunately, 72 lost their lives that evening. My take-home message from all this is be familiar with your local hospital policy for major incidents, that you're not alone, that a lot of specialties will help and gladly do so. I don't think anyone would say no. In the same way when COVID happened, we sort of stepped up to the mark, and I've seen peds trying to help out in adult A&E, doing bits and bobs, and I really appreciate it. I think when crisis comes, I think we all just help out, and I really love the specialty that we do. Truth of the matter is that in major incidents, though, and that being said, everyone will want to help, but actually what you need to do is tell them to stay at home and rest, because we need them to come and relieve us when our shift is over, because we'll be exhausted otherwise. So actually that is also just as important. Consider airway early, especially with soot around the nose and mouth, a dangerous sign. Give oxygen liberally and freely. And thoughts with coronavirus, I think that's something we need to think about as well. With it going on, how do we need to rethink about, if something were to happen, how would we separate them out? Surely everyone with a smoke inhalation would be having high rest rates, coughing, it's something to think about. I'm going to do this twice. I'm hoping. Fine. And lastly, I just want to say thank you to a lot of my colleagues. Most of them were F2s who helped me collect a lot of this data, which I haven't really shared, but because I thought it wouldn't really be that interesting to this particular audience. And then obviously a lot of my consultant colleagues who are the trauma leads, who are the trauma leads for this area. And I've left a little QR code for those who might want to use their phone to take a quick picture of that, and then they could just go straight to this particular guideline. It's really useful. It goes over things really well, great diagrams. And that's about it, really. I don't really have much else to say. I will be giving the link to this presentation on the little chat group in a second. And thank you for your time. I'm just going to stop recording.